If you've never watched someone call 911 to evict the wrong woman, let me introduce you to the day my wife and I discovered just how far an HOA president would go to feel powerful. It was early morning at our lake cabin. The kind of quiet sunrise you wait months for, soft light through the pine trees, steam rising from my coffee mug, and the promise of a peaceful weekend. My wife, Rachel, was brushing her teeth, half asleep, while I stood in the kitchen watching the fog roll across Lake Pine. That's when her phone buzzed with a priority dispatch alert, something that rarely shows up when she's off duty. She leaned over and tapped the speakerphone with one hand, still holding her toothbrush in the other. "Ma'am," the dispatcher began, "we've received a 911 report that a woman named Rachel Merritt is unlawfully occupying a residence in Lake Pine Estates. The complainant is requesting immediate removal." Rachel froze mid-brush, then slowly turned to look at me like she had just been accused of robbing her own bank. She spit into the sink and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Honey, apparently I'm illegally living in our own house." I almost choked on my coffee. There was only one person in the entire community reckless enough to weaponize 911 like a personal complaint hotline: Karen, the self-appointed dictator of the HOA. And the funniest part? She had absolutely no idea she just tried to evict the woman who runs the entire state police force. But none of this came out of nowhere. This wasn't a sudden explosion. The truth is, the spark had already been lit 3 days earlier, and Karen had spent every hour since then fanning it with gleeful dedication. If you want to understand why this moment wasn't surprising at all, you have to know what led up to it. 3 days earlier, Rachel and I had driven up to the cabin for our first actual break in months. After her recent promotion to commander, she'd been working non-stop late nights, emergency briefings, political meetings, crises that never take weekends off. I could see the exhaustion settling into her bones, no matter how steady she tried to appear. That cabin was supposed to be our escape. The tall pines, the quiet lake, the dock where we planned to sit with our feet in the water, it was meant to be peace. We didn't even finish unloading groceries before trouble arrived. Rachel was humming, carrying paper bags into the kitchen, when a white Lexus rolled into our driveway like it had GPS coordinates for drama. The door opened, and out stepped a woman you could smell before you heard. Perfume thick enough to tranquilize moose, sunglasses large enough to see the future, and a knitted sweater in a color so loud it probably violated noise ordinances. Karen, clipboard in hand, expression already set to superiority mode. She didn't wave. She didn't introduce herself. She just marched around the property taking notes like she was appraising a crime scene. Rachel tried to be polite and asked if we could help her with something, but Karen barely acknowledged her. She fired off questions about unauthorized occupancy, demanded to know if we were renters, and then announced that she didn't recognize us from her database, like we owed her an explanation for existing on our own land. When Rachel told her we owned the property, Karen squinted like she was sniffing out a lie. Then she informed us that she saw no occupancy notice in the HOA portal. And let me tell you something about that portal. It was a digital fossil, a glitchy, half-broken WordPress website from the Stone Age with passwords that expired every 48 hours and pages titled Final, Draft, Copy, 4, Revised. Yet Karen acted like it was a classified government system. But then she found her real weapon, the ownership records. The cabin was purchased under my LLC for tax reasons, meaning my name was on the title, not Rachel's. And Karen pounced on that fact like it was a golden ticket. She printed out a warning notice in Comic Sans, no less declaring that Rachel must vacate until her residency could be verified. Rachel handed the paper right back and said, "No thanks. I don't take orders from you." That was the moment Karen snapped. From that point forward, she launched a crusade. Every morning we woke up to a new complaint. Pine cones on our lawn were suddenly a violation. Rachel drinking coffee on the porch became excessive porch occupancy. She even taped a formal complaint accusing Rachel of unauthorized cohabitation to our mailbox, like she expected applause. So when the 911 call finally came in that morning, we weren't shocked. Annoyed, yes, Disgusted? Definitely. But surprised? Not even a little. What we didn't know yet was how much worse Karen planned to make things, or how spectacularly it would all collapse on her. Because she didn't just try to evict a random unidentified woman. She tried to evict Commander Rachel Merritt, head of the state police force, with a direct line to the governor and more authority in her badge than the entire HOA combined. And Karen was about to learn exactly what kind of storm she had unleashed. When the patrol cars crept up our dirt road, their blue lights flickering between the pines, it felt less like law enforcement responding to an emergency and more like two officers arriving for a situation they had already guessed was nonsense. I watched them from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee as if this were a morning show instead of our life. The two officers stepped out cautiously, looking around the property as though expecting to find a hostage situation, a break-in, or at least something more serious than what they would soon discover. One officer unfolded a notepad he clearly didn't believe, glancing at it the way someone looks at a suspicious receipt. The other kept scanning the cabin, his expression shifting between confusion and quiet embarrassment. They had been dispatched for a report claiming a dangerous intruder was refusing to leave, and yet everything in front of them looked painfully normal. Rachel opened the front door before they even knocked. She didn't walk out with dramatic authority or bark orders like some TV cop stereotype. Instead, she simply stepped into the doorway with the calm, grounded confidence that comes naturally to someone who has spent a career walking into real emergencies, not manufactured HOA fantasies. Her presence alone shifted the energy around us. The officers straightened instinctively, recognizing a level of command that can't be faked. She didn't introduce herself first. She let them explain why they were there. "Ma'am," the first officer said carefully, "we received a report that you're unlawfully occupying this property. We're required to check." Rachel held up a hand gently, stopping him without hostility. "I'm the homeowner's wife," she said evenly. "And I'm also Commander Rachel Merritt, State Police." The reaction was immediate. Both officers blinked. One swallowed hard. The other took an involuntary half-step back, as if someone had suddenly spotlighted the rank difference. "Commander Merritt?" he repeated, voice climbing an octave. Rachel nodded once. "You're not in trouble," she added softly. "But you've been sent here under false pretenses." The officers exchanged a look that could only be described as, "Oh God, this is above our pay grade." They apologized twice before asking if they could conduct a quick walkthrough, just to close out the call properly. Rachel agreed, because she knew they were just doing their jobs. As they stepped inside, one of them glanced around the living room and whispered, almost awkwardly, "This definitely doesn't look like a squatter situation." I tried not to laugh, but the truth was clear. They already knew they had been dragged into an HOA tantrum rather than a legitimate emergency. When they finished their walkthrough, both officers apologized again and prepared to leave. But just as they turned to head back to their vehicles, a car rolled into the driveway with theatrical slowness. A white Lexus. Karen had arrived, no doubt, expecting to watch a dramatic arrest, maybe even imagining she'd witness Rachel being escorted out in handcuffs. The smile on her face was the kind of satisfaction people only feel when they think they've finally proven they were right all along. She stepped out with the energy of someone ready to accept an award for most vigilant neighborhood defender. The moment she saw the officers standing peacefully beside Rachel, no shouting, no arrests, nothing burning, her smile twitched. She marched forward, pointing at Rachel as if presenting evidence. "Officers, this woman is living here without authorization from the HOA. I filed the complaint. I expect action." Her voice carried the full force of someone who believed she controlled the situation. But the officers didn't even look at Rachel this time. They turned their attention fully to Karen, and the shift was immediate. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, "we've already spoken with Commander Merritt." Karen's eyebrows furrowed. "Commander?" She looked at Rachel as if the word offended her personally. "Commander of what?" Rachel stepped forward slightly, hands in her pockets, posture relaxed yet unmistakably authoritative. of the state police force, she said. And you filed a false 911 report on me. Karen's jaw dropped open, not in fear, but disbelief, as if the universe had betrayed her storyline. Well, regardless of her job, she stammered, she still needs HOA approval to be here. She's not on the ownership papers. One of the officers cleared his throat, trying very hard not to sound amused. Ma'am, this is private property. HOA rules do not override state law or property rights. Karen crossed her arms like a petulant child, denied dessert. But she isn't registered in the occupant database, she insisted. She has no right to stay overnight until residency is verified. I stepped beside Rachel then, unable to stay silent any longer. She's my wife, I said plainly. She lives here as much as I do. And you don't have the authority to tell either of us where we can sleep. Karen opened her mouth again, but the officer gently raised a hand. Ma'am, you've misused 911. That's a crime. We're documenting this incident. I suggest you stop now. And that was the beginning of the unraveling. Karen's face shifted from outrage to panic to confusion in a matter of seconds. She realized too late that she'd picked a fight with someone she never should have targeted. And while the officers walked back to their patrol cars, Karen remained frozen in place, gripping her clipboard like it might keep her from falling apart. Little did she know, this wasn't the end. This was only the first consequence. Because calling 911 had triggered something much bigger than an HOA complaint. It triggered an official investigation. And Karen was about to find out what real accountability looks like. Karen didn't leave our driveway right away. She stood frozen, gripping her clipboard as if squeezing it hard enough would reverse everything that had just happened. The officers returned to their vehicles, quietly discussing something between themselves before pulling away. Their blue lights faded off the trees, leaving behind a silence only broken by the wind moving through the pines. Rachel shut the door gently, but I could still feel the tension vibrating in the air like static before a storm. I knew she was angry. Rachel rarely showed anger, but when she did, it was colder than fire. She paced once, twice, taking slow breaths to steady herself. She used emergency services to play gatekeeper, Rachel murmured. More to herself than to me. More to herself, Rachel murmured. Rachel murmured. Rachel murmured. Rachel murmured. That could have pulled officers away from an actual crisis. Her voice was low, controlled, the voice of a commander calculating consequences rather than emotions. When Rachel finally sat down at the kitchen table, she pulled out her phone and opened the secure portal used by law enforcement personnel. It wasn't for retaliation. It wasn't for ego. It was because misuse of 911 wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. She typed up a formal incident report with the same precision she used in every professional matter. She explained the false claim, the lack of any actual threat, the HOA president's escalating behavior, and the pattern of harassment over the past several days. She didn't embellish anything. She didn't need to. The facts alone were damning. When she hit submit, a part of me knew that Karen's crusade had just crossed a line she couldn't step back from. About an hour later, as Rachel stepped outside to get some air on the porch, Karen's Lexus suddenly reversed back up our driveway. She rolled down her window with a burst of authority that immediately rubbed me wrong. I need to speak with your husband, she snapped at Rachel, as if Rachel were an obstacle rather than a person. This is a matter between me and the property owner. Rachel simply leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed, calm as a lake at sunrise. Anything you say to him, you can say to me. Karen scoffed, looking offended. It's a legal issue, she insisted. He's the one on the deed. You are an unregistered guest. Rachel tilted her head slightly, the faintest smile touching her lips. Karen, I just filed a report for your false 911 call. You might want to choose your next words carefully. Karen's face went pale, then flushed red in the span of a heartbeat. You reported me? She stammered. For trying to keep order in this neighborhood? Rachel didn't move from her spot. "You reported a married homeowner as an intruder," she said calmly. "That's not keeping order. That's abusing emergency services because you didn't get your way." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the words tangled, her indignation folding into panic. "I didn't think they would send officers," she muttered, suddenly sounding less like a queen and more like someone realizing she'd stepped into quicksand. "I just wanted compliance. I didn't know." Rachel stopped her gently. "You didn't know who you were calling on," she finished, "and you didn't care." For a moment, the facade of the untouchable HOA president cracked. Karen looked genuinely rattled, gripping the steering wheel like she needed something solid to hold on to. "Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot," she said, forcing a smile that wobbled at the edges. "I'm sure we can handle this, neighbor to neighbor, without getting authorities involved." I stepped outside then, standing beside Rachel. "Karen," I said quietly, "you involved authorities. You called 911. You escalated this, not us." She stared at us as if trying to figure out a way back to control. "Then let's de-escalate," she said quickly. "Just submit the occupancy forms and I'll mark you compliant." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. She still believed she had power. She still believed the HOA had authority over us. And she still believed she had the right to dictate who lived in our cabin. Rachel took a slow breath and stepped forward. "We don't answer to the HOA," she said firmly. "Not legally. Not structurally. Not at all. This cabin is outside your governance. And this is the last time we're going to explain that to you." Karen's composure collapsed completely. She blinked rapidly, breathing fast, realizing finally that her entire campaign had been built on a fantasy. She shifted the car back into drive, muttering something under her breath before speeding away, gravel spitting beneath her tires. But as the dust settled, Rachel turned to me, expression thoughtful, the calm determination back in her eyes. "She's not finished," she said quietly. "People like her don't stop after a warning. They double down." I knew she was right. Karen wasn't going to retreat quietly. She wasn't going to accept limits. And she certainly wasn't going to let go of power she believed was rightfully hers. What we didn't know yet was how far she was willing to go next, or how big the fallout would be. Because Karen had poked a dragon. And dragons don't sleep through the second strike. The following morning began with a strange, uneasy stillness. Birdsong was absent, replaced by the distant hum of engines somewhere down the hill. Too many engines for this early hour. Rachel was already on the porch with her coffee when I stepped outside, her eyes focused toward the tree line as if she could sense something coming long before it appeared. She didn't say a word, just handed me my mug and kept watching. The low rumble grew louder, closer, heavier. Something about the sound wasn't casual. It wasn't a neighbor driving by, or a landscaper at work. This was machinery, construction-grade machinery. When the first yellow bulldozer crawled into view through the trees, my stomach dropped. A second followed. Then a truck with the HOA logo printed on the door. Rachel set her mug down slowly. "She wouldn't," she murmured. "Not after yesterday." But as the convoy stopped at the bottom of our driveway, it became painfully clear. Yes, Karen would. Karen stepped out of the lead vehicle with her clipboard pressed to her chest like armor, flanked by two HOA board members who looked far less confident than she did. She marched forward with the kind of purpose only someone completely detached from reality could maintain. "Morning," she called out, wearing a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're here for the easement enforcement and lot compliance review." Rachel didn't move from her spot on the porch. I could practically feel the cold radiating from her silence. "Karen," Rachel finally said, voice low but sharp, "if those machines come anywhere near our property line, someone is getting arrested today." Karen didn't flinch, but her board members did. "This land falls under the shared maintenance agreement," she insisted. "We have the right to clear brush, mark boundaries, and ensure community standards are met." I stepped down off the porch, walking toward her with slow, deliberate steps. "This land," I said, pointing toward the clearing behind our cabin, "is privately owned, fully outside the HOA's jurisdiction. There is no shared maintenance agreement. And after the stunt you pulled yesterday, you should be nowhere near our property." Karen huffed, flipping through her clipboard papers with rehearsed annoyance. "I've already spoken to our legal team," she snapped. "The community has always maintained this area. That gives us governance by precedent." Rachel laughed, a short, humorless sound that made the board members shift uncomfortably. "You think tradition overrides property law?" she asked. "Is that really your argument?" Karen stiffened. "We're operating within our rights," she declared, though her voice wavered. "And we will not be intimidated by threats." Behind her, one of the bulldozer operators hesitated, raising a hand. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you sure we're supposed to clear this? There's no HOA stake markings here." Karen snapped her head toward him. "Proceed," she ordered. "This is approved." But Rachel was already lifting her phone, scrolling quickly before pressing a button. "Sheriff's office," she said calmly into the receiver. "This is Sergeant Rachel Hale. I need a unit dispatched to my residence for an attempted unlawful property intrusion involving heavy equipment." Karen's face drained of color. "You can't," she began. But Rachel cut her off with a quiet, razor-sharp, "Watch me." The bulldozer operator immediately backed the machine up several feet, clearly wanting no part of a legal battle with law enforcement. The second operator followed suit. Karen whirled around toward the board members, whispering harshly, gesturing wildly, looking more and more like someone whose entire illusion of power was slipping through her fingers. "We can't leave," she hissed. "If we back down now, we lose authority." One of the board members shook his head nervously. "We shouldn't be here," he muttered. "This doesn't feel legal." She called the sheriff, Karen, but Karen refused to retreat. Instead, she took a step toward us, composing herself with visible effort. "You're escalating this," she said tightly. "All we wanted was compliance." Rachel stepped off the porch and closed the distance between them until they stood only a few feet apart. "You keep using that word," Rachel said quietly, "but what you want isn't compliance, it's control, and you don't get to control people who don't belong to your HOA." For a moment, the forest went completely silent. Even the machines seemed to settle into stillness, as if waiting. Then, faintly at first, the sound of tires crunching gravel echoed up the road. Karen turned sharply. The sheriff's truck was approaching, lights flashing but not racing. Calm, controlled, intentional. Karen exhaled shakily, knowing exactly what that meant. This wasn't an emergency. This wasn't chaos. This was accountability, arriving right on schedule. And the moment the sheriff stepped out of his vehicle, Rachel gave me a look. A quiet, steady look that told me everything. Rachel stepped onto the porch with the same calm authority she carried into every high-pressure briefing room. The two responding officers stiffened immediately, their unsure expressions melting into recognition the moment they saw her badge hanging openly from her belt. One of them actually swallowed hard before speaking. "Commander Merritt, ma'am, we were told there was an intruder," he said, mortified. Rachel crossed her arms. "Yes, I'm the intruder in my own home. According to the HOA president, anyway." The younger officer exhaled in relief so big it puffed dust off the porch railing. "Ma'am, we're so sorry." The call made it sound like an act of trespassing. Dean stepped beside her. "She's been harassing my wife since the day we arrived. You guys are just the latest victims of her imagination." That's when Karen came storming out from behind the patrol cars, waving a stack of papers like she was presenting evidence at a trial. "There," she yelled. "That woman is not on the ownership record. Remove her immediately." Everything froze. The officers stared at her. Rachel stared at her. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-chirp. The senior officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you filed a false police report." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your emergency call stated an unknown hostile intruder. This is the commander of the state police. Karen's face drained of color so fast it was almost impressive. Rachel stepped closer, keeping her voice calm but razor sharp. You've been warned repeatedly about harassment, about trespassing, about threatening residents. But the portal, the rules, the occupancy code, Karen stammered like a computer overheating. There is no occupancy code that supersedes state law, Rachel replied. And your portal is held together with duct tape and Comic Sans. One of the officers actually coughed to hide his laugh. Karen, realizing she was out of weapons, out of excuses, and out of luck, finally tried the last card she had left. I'm the HOA president, she whispered desperately. Rachel nodded. And I'm the reason 911 dispatchers are now rolling their eyes every time your name pops up. Karen was escorted back toward her Lexus, still sputtering, still clutching her useless papers. The officer informed her she'd be receiving citations for filing a false emergency report, harassment, attempted misuse of law enforcement resources, trespassing on private property. She opened her mouth to protest, but Rachel raised one finger and she froze. This ends now, Rachel said. You will not approach our home again. You will not tape anything to our door, our fence, or our mailbox. You will communicate only through official HOA channels and only for legitimate matters. If you break any of these rules. She paused and leaned slightly closer. I'll handle it personally. Karen nodded so fast, she looked like a bobblehead with stage fright. After she drove off with a tire squeal dramatic enough to be a confession, the officers apologized again, shook Rachel's hand, and left us with a peace offering of pure silence. Rachel finally sighed and leaned into Dean's shoulder. Is it bad that I'm relieved? I've dealt with cartel lieutenants with less ego. Dean laughed. At least they know when to surrender. For the first time since arriving at the lake, the air felt calm again. The water shimmered through the pines, the wind rustled the leaves, and everything finally resembled the peaceful retreat they had wanted. Karen never approached the house again. 2 weeks later, the HOA board voted her out. Turns out dozens of neighbors had similar stories, but didn't know they could speak up until Rachel unintentionally became their symbol of enough is enough. And every time Dean and Rachel sit on their porch swing now, sipping coffee, watching the sunrise, one thought always makes them smile. Karen tried to evict the wrong woman, and she learned the hard way. You don't call the cops on the person in charge of the cops.